Hey, this is the Derpveloper, and welcome back to our SQF Basics Primer series. In this video, we are still talking about data types, and we're going to go over Booleans and arrays. Booleans, there's not much to talk about, but arrays are their own beast in themselves, or in itself, I guess. If we have time, we'll go into objects. I don't think we're going to, so we'll touch on bools real quick, and then we'll spend the rest of the video talking about arrays, and then we'll go into object, group, and side in a later video, which will sum up the whole data type section of the primer series, which is very exciting because we can move on. Alright, so let's get started. A Boolean type is simply a true or false value. There's nothing really other than that to say. A true or false value can be 0 or 1. It's used in conditions. You can set variables to the type, to a Boolean type, so you can do like underscore t equals true, and then when you reference underscore t, its value would be true. So you could use it in like an if statement, stuff like that. So that's all there really is to say about Booleans, is it's a true or false value. Very useful for conditions, obviously. Now on to arrays. Arrays are lists of items of varying variable types. Arrays can be both single dimension and multidimensional. Creating arrays is called declaring arrays. When we declare an array, you can create it as either empty, or you can give it a predefined value. When you do create an array, the order runs from left to right and begins with the number 0. So you will never see, so index 1 will always refer to the second element in an array. It always starts at 0 and goes up from there. So even if you have 3 elements in your array, you're only going to have an index of 2 because it starts 0, 1, 2. So when you declare the array, again, you declare it with your identifier, and then you have your square brackets. You have an open bracket and a close bracket. And if we were to return the count of this array, it would be 0 because there's nothing in it. Typically, when you declare an array, you declare it with predefined elements. You can create it empty for if it fits the purpose, but typically you're going to populate it. And you would just do that by giving it an identifier, and then your open and close brackets, and then you would fill it with whatever data type you're trying to store in there. So in this case, we're storing 2 strings. You'll notice that with each element in the array, we have a comma separating each element, except for the last element. You don't want to add a comma after the last element, because it will cause an error, an unexpected error, and will mess up all your code. So, comma between all the elements except after the last element. Multidimensional arrays. These are single dimension arrays when you just create a single array with your values in it. A multidimensional array is arrays within an array. So, multi-array 1 equals, here we have our array, and then inside this array we have 2 arrays. There's one, there's another, and we have a string and 3 numbers in each one. Now, if we were to count multi-array, it's only going to output 2 because it's only seeing 2 elements here, because they're 2 arrays, but they're both an element inside this array. However, if we use the select function to select the first element, which is this array, we get the output of 4 because there are 4 elements within the first element of this array. If that's confusing, don't worry about it. We're gonna be covering it a lot more once we start coding more. Associative arrays. Now, associative arrays are basically, they work based on a key value kind of system. You have a string value, which is known as a key, and then you're associating a collection of items or elements or whatever with that string. So if you wanted to, if this were supported in SQF, up here you can see that associative arrays are not part of the language. However, they can be approximated or simulated or made similar to by creating a structure with the first element as a string and subsequent elements as arrays. So basically what we would be doing here is if associative arrays were actually part of SQF, then item 1 would be your key, and then your value or your values would be this array here. So you could, if you wanted to select an item out of this array or something, you could select the whole array using its key value, and then the next argument after that would be like whatever index you're trying to access. However, in SQF this doesn't work, and approximating it is really only for, I think, aesthetic purposes. I've never really done it very much because there's no need to. As you can see here, if we count the ASOC type array, which is this whole array here, it's only going to output 2, because here we have one array and we have our second array. So there's 2 elements overall in this array. And then if we were to count ASOC type array, so we're taking this array and then we're using the select function to select this first array, it would still only output 2, because inside this array we have a string, which is one element, and another array, which is our second element. However, you can select this these elements by simply going within parentheses. Basically, it's the order of operations, like in math class. It's going to select it's going to run everything in the parentheses first. You can select our first array, and then you select the first index, which is this first element here, and then from this first element you're selecting the second element with the index of 1, which would be this array here, and it outputs 3 because there's 3 elements in that array. Now here's where associative arrays in other languages would really help. In this case, you could do, in these parentheses, if SQF supported key values or associative arrays, you could just say, you could select item, that would be its key, or sorry, you could do ASOC type array, and then probably in like brackets you can say item 1, which would be the key, and then you could do select 0 or select 1, and that would select one of these elements out of the array. I'm not going to touch on it any more than that because it's almost pointless to do associative arrays. You can really, the only point to this key value is to you're basically naming this array. It's like you're giving multiple names to these arrays here, because you could technically do ASOC type array select 0, which would select this first array, and then you could do select 0 again, which would output this string, which is item 1, and that could technically be your key or whatever, so there's really no point into approximating associative arrays other than for organizational purposes. Referencing and setting element values. Don't worry if you didn't understand what select is doing. It's pretty self-explanatory, but this is where we cover select. So unlike in other languages, referencing elements within script is performed with the use of the select functions. As script functions allow stacking of functions, select can be used multiple times provided that each select returns an array which can be selected or an element. So selecting an element from a single dimensional array. We create our array, and then we populate it with 3 different strings, and then we can say my array element equals my single array select 0, which would be selecting this first element, which is select 0. Selecting from multidimensional arrays, it works the same as what we talked about up here. We have our where is it? There we go. We have our multidimensional array with 2 different arrays in there with 2 strings as their elements. And we can select the first array. We can store the first array in this variable by creating an identifier. Then we select our array here, use the select function, select the first element, and now we are storing this first array in this select first variable, and if you count it, it would count 2 elements because that's what's in that array. However, if you wanted to select something from this multidimensional array, if you wanted to select an actual individual element, you would say _ my multi-array select 0, which selects this first element here, and then select 0, which selects the first element inside this first array. And that would output that string array1 lm1. If you would like to change the value of an element within an array, then the set function must be used. So we create our array here. It's a single dimension array, item 1 and item 2. We simply have two strings. Here's a typo. So if we were to output this first element in the array by my single array select 0, it would output item 1 because that's what that value is. And then we would take our array, use the set function, and then we pass in an array of arguments, and it takes two arguments. You select the index that you would like to set, which is our first element, item 1, and we want to replace it with the value of foo. So now that array would be foo item 2. And it has it down here. And then if you wanted to select that first element, you do my single array, select 0, and it would output foo. Another thing to keep in mind is the bounds. Now the bounds of an array are simply its indices. So like up here, for example, if you were to do my single array select 0, that would be in bounds. If you were to do my single array select 1, that would be in bounds. If you did my single array select 2, that would be out of bounds because there is no 2. But notice what it says down here. If the index rounded to a negative number, then an arrow 0 divisor message will be displayed in game. It doesn't like negative numbers. An index can never be a negative number. You can never have an index of -1. It's always 0 through whatever, through 9,999,999. So where were we? Down here. And then, but if the index is rounded to a positive number, so if we did my single array select 5, the array will resize to incorporate the index as its last value, and then each element between the last valid element or the element that had an actual value and the new set element will be the null type. So for example, let's say if we did my single array set 5 to foo, it would expand this array so that way the fifth index has the value of string foo. So then at this point my single array would be, select 0 would be item 1, select 1 would be item 2, select 2 would be null, select 3 would be null, select 4 would be null, and then select 5 would be the string foo. So that's kind of neat. You don't get you don't really run into as many problems unless you're using the value or the count of an array as some sort of calculation or whatever. Then it might screw you over. But anyways, just know that the index, if it's a negative number, you'll get an error 0 divisor message. If you set it out of bounds to a positive number, the array will resize itself, and the given index will be the last index. Whew. Okay, so adding or appending to arrays. Appending to arrays is done by the use of the plus operator in the same way that a string is concatenated. However, each time plus is used, a new array is created. So if we create two arrays, we have array 1 and 2, and each array stores a single element of type string 1 and 2. And then we say array 3 equals array 1 plus array 2. Now array 3 is going to be a brand new array with two elements, both of them strings, and it's 1 and 2. And you can also use the append command to achieve the same thing. So using append is the same as adding two arrays together. You can do array 1 append array 2, and it does the same thing. It creates a new array with two elements in it. And here we're counting, and then here's the pushback command, and what this does is that you can add single elements to an existing array by doing this. So if you were to take array 1, which right now only has a single string element in it, and you did array 1 pushback and passed it a string of 2, it would now have two elements in it of two strings, and first says 1, second says 2. It's pretty neat, pretty easy to work with. Looping to access elements. So this is interesting because there are two ways you can do this. You can use the for function, or you can use the ForEach function. If you use the for function, you can loop over a finite number of items, and that's typically when it's most useful, is when you need to, for example, if you only have 20 units and you want to loop from 1 to 20, you can use the for function, and then you can also use the count function to loop through an array of any length. So if you had an array that was 20, had 20 elements in it, then you could count that array, and that would be how many times you could loop. However, say you have an array of 20 units and you only want to loop through from 10 to 20, then that's when for would be useful. So for example, we create our array here. We have 0, 1, 2 are the indexes or indices, and the values are 1, 2, 3, and 4. And now to get the count of this array, if you did count my array, it would return 4. But since we're going to be looping through each index, we don't have an index of 4. We only have an index of 3. So you would do count underscore my array, which would return 4, and then you just subtract 1, which would be 3. So then down here we have our for function, and in for you create a variable to store the number that we're currently on, or the currently selected number. And then you can say for underscore x in quotations from 0, so we start at 0, to underscore my count, which would be whatever, whatever array length you had, or whatever count. Or you can also just hard code this, and you can say from 0 to 10. Or going back to our 20 units example, if you had 20 units inside of an array and you only wanted to loop through 10 to 20, you would say for x from 10 to 20, or you would say from 10 to 20, and it would start at 10 and go up to 20. Then each time it loops through, here we're saying current element equals my array select underscore x, which in this case, if we started at 0, the first time it loops through, underscore x would be equal to 0, so it would select this string here. And then once it loops through, it increments by 1, so underscore x becomes 1, and then 2, and then 3, and so on and so forth until you reach whatever value you have set here. Now the for each loop, again, for is good for a finite number of items. If you're just looking to loop through an entire array, you don't need to have a specific number of loops done. You just need to loop through the entire array. You're going to want to use for each, because for each will automatically loop through the entire array without you having to create a range for it to loop through, and you don't need to create a variable that will store whatever number you're on. Instead, for each creates that magic variable underscore x that we talked about in our last variable, in our last video, excuse me, and it starts a little bit different too. Instead of saying, for each blah 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 and then having the code, you have your open curly brace, then whatever code you want to run, then you have your curly brace that closes it, and then you say for each and whatever array you're passing into it. And so each time it loops, it'll just go one at a time through all of the indices inside, or through all the elements inside of that array. So diaglog is just outputting to a log file. So if we were to run this, it would just loop through, and output 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 until it reaches the end of the array. Okay, so again, the for function, use it if you need a finite number of loops. For each if you're going to just be looping through an entire array and you don't care how many items are in it. Copying. This is done by the plus unary operator. It copies an array and sets the array variable to point to this new array. So if we create an array in array 1, we just have 3 numbers, and then in array 2 we say equals plus underscore array 1. We're just creating a copy of array 1, which would now be set to 1, 2, 3. Note that a deep copy is made using the plus unary operator, and this is referring to multidimensional arrays. So if you create a multidimensional array and you store it in underscore a, and you have your first array, your first element is an array of 3 ones, and then the second array is the same thing. You can create a copy of that array, underscore b equals plus underscore a. So now underscore b is also a multi-dimensional array that has ones in it. And then you say underscore b select 0, so we're selecting the first array, and then we're saying set, select the first element in the first array, and we're going to set that to 4. So now underscore b is 4, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, while underscore a is still 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. So this means that a subarray gets copied instead of copying a pointer to the original subarray. And don't worry so much about this if this is kind of confusing. We're not going to use this very often, but it is useful to know. Take note that arrays are as immutable as objects. Assigning a variable to another variable referencing array does not copy it. So basically, if we create an array inside of B, and then we take C and we set its value to B, it's always going to be the value of B. So if we were to take B and set its first element to 4, so that would say 4, 2, 3. C is also going to be 4, 2, 3 because it's just setting its value to whatever B is. It's not creating a copy of it. Subtraction. This is done by the subtraction binary operator. It takes two arrays and returns a new array that contains all of the excuse me, starting to lose my voice. I've been talking a lot. Contains all of the items in the first array that were not in the second array. So, for example, we create array 1, which has 1, 2, player 2, string, string 3. And then we take array 2, we give it 2, player, and string. So now, when we do array 3, we do underscore array 1 minus underscore array 2. And what this is doing is it's going to look at these two arrays, and we're going to say, okay, does array 1 have the value 1 in it? No, it doesn't. So we're going to add that. Does array 2 have the value 2 in it? Yes, it does, so we don't need to add that. Does it have the value player? Does it have the object player? Yes, it does, so we're not going to add that. We're back to 2. Does it have the value of 2 in it? Yes, it does, so we're not going to add that one. Does it have the value string in there? Yes, it does. It has the value string. Does it have the value string? It does, so we're not going to add it. Does it have the value 3? No. So we're going to add it. So now array 3 would have the contents of 1 and 3 because those were the only two values that weren't already existing in array 2. Note, subtracting an array from itself will always return an empty array, which is kind of obvious. So if you did array 2 equals array 1 minus array 1, you're just going to get an empty string. Now here it says nested arrays cannot be subtracted, and here's a workaround. But in Arma 3, this is not the case. It does work. So if you create a multi-dimensional array, and 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3 in A1, and then you set A2 as a multi-dimensional array with the array containing 2 and 2, and then you subtract those two arrays, it will recognize, hey, I have an array of 2, 2, but not 1, 1, and 3, 3, so make my value 1, 1, and 3, 3. Alright, so that about does it for the functionality and the usage of arrays. If you're still finding yourself confused, you can read over the wiki page again. You can watch the video again, try and understand it. Feel free to ask questions in the comments. If you're not understanding something, please ask in the comments, and I will do my best to answer your questions or re-explain it in the comments. What I don't want you to do is say, oh, I don't understand this, but I'm going to move on. Because if you're not understanding it, then I want to make sure you're understanding before you move on. So yeah, let me know what it is that you're not understanding about certain things, and I will do my best to explain it to you in the comments. Here we just have some quirks and errors that you should know. I'm not going to touch on these because I'm never going to do this. I'm never going to set an index to 0.5. There's no point to it because it just rounds up or down. And I haven't even tried this in Arma, so I don't even know if this would work. Oh, my apologies. That's my alarm telling me it's time to go do the dishes. Anyways, so we're never going to set an index to 0.5 or 1.5 or 2.5. It's pointless. It's either going to round up or down, or it's going to give us an error. So don't worry about that so much. Just don't do it. Just plain and simple. Now, more talking about bounds, it's known as range. So when an index is out of range, it's also known as out of bounds. And again, like we talked about, if an index is negative, you get an error. And God, I can't say that. An error zero divisor message. And if it's positive, the return value will be of null type because the array expands to meet that index request, but there's nothing being stored in it. So some accesses which are out of bounds, which would be array select 0, but there's no elements in there, so there is no index 0. Another one is array select 1. There's only one element in there, so its index is 0. Select 1 would be null. This would be a error 0 divisor message because an index cannot be a negative number. Accesses which are inbounds, select 0. That's inbounds because it is only one element, so the index is 0. This is inbounds because select 0.1 would be rounded down to 0. And then array element negative 0.3 would be rounded up to 0, so it's also considered inbounds. It's just useless. I don't see the point in this. Maybe I'm not as advanced of as wow. Not even gonna try. Don't do this. Don't do 0.3 unless there's some universe rule that's saying this will only work as this value. Anyway, so that does a bit for arrays, and it also does it for this video. My throat hurts because I've been trying to record this video for the past 2 hours. So, I will see you in the next video, and I hope that you are walking away with some newfound knowledge. And again, if you don't understand something, please let me know in the comments. I will do my best to explain it in the comments. If not, then we will be providing heavy examples once we get into our actual project, which I'm so excited for. Anyway, enough freaking rambling. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next line.